After selling over 1 million copies of their debut album, breaking the door down for Southern rappers and winning Best New Rap Group, Outkast established themselves as permanent staples of the hip-hop industry. 2 years later, the duo follows up with their second album, ATLiens. ATLiens is a marked departure from Southern playlists of Cadillac music, with an emphasis on a much more darker, space-themed production and much more intricate wordplay and flow. Instead of expanding their successes of Southern playlists of Cadillac music, the duo completely changed their styles for this album, which becomes a trademark for the group for many albums to come. Being an even higher critical and commercial success as the last album, join me as we dive into Outkast's superb sophomore outing, ATLiens. The first thing you notice when listening to this album is the overall darker tone it has. There's much more muted tones within the bass line and kicks. Gone are the funk and R&B instruments. Instead, there's much more abstract sound effects, spacey sounding chords, and synths. Tempos are even slower here than a previous album, and you have a lot more filters over vocals rather than natural voices for the hooks or voice samples. Speaking of samples, there's a lot less here overall, and the production is much more sparse and less dense than Southern playlistics. There also seems to be a much bigger emphasis on record scratching and manipulation of the voice. ATLiens is much more abstract than their previous work and still stands out today in terms of its uniqueness. The album really began the trend that no one else sounded like Outkast. Even listening to this album today, there's not a clear indication that this album was from the mid to late 90s, but something that stands out immediately in the sound of the duo is the new level of maturity. Big Boy became a father and Andre earned his high school GED, but you can also hear the actual maturity in their voices and flow. They are no longer 16 and 17-year-olds making an album. Now it's men in their early 20s and the growth and maturity is evident. In Big Boy's interview with Spin, he had this to say about the shift in sound for ATLiens. We were teenagers, so Southern playlistic, it gave us a chance to see the world. We traveled a lot and performed all over the world. You know, you got two teenagers from Georgia who hadn't been past South Carolina or Florida, seeing Europe and the West Coast and New York. It kind of broadened our horizons. The world is much bigger than where you live. This maturity influences the production of the album, as this was the album when Big Boy and Andre experimented with producing their own tracks, with them producing ATLiens, Wheels of Steel, Elevators, In the Woods, and 13th Floor Growing Old. This was the first time that they could have creative control over the music and create their own signature brand and sound. In an interview with Spin, Big Boy stated how LaFace was worried about the success of the song Elevators, and when it blew up after being released as a single, they allowed Outkast to continue to pick their own singles. Even the album cover, drawn by former DC Comics artist and current Marvel Comics artist Frank Gomez, exudes the notion that the look, sound, and feel of ATLiens is completely different from anything else heard before. When it comes to the structure of the album, Andre and Big Boy shifted to mostly tackling one verse each, and will either do a verse with both of them exchanging a few bars or extending the hooks or adding bridges to the song. So while the duo takes less verses overall, what's here lyrically is a noticeable step up above from the prior album, and the songs have much more depth to them and added musical elements. One song of particular note is 13th Floor Growing Old. This song starts with a beautiful, melancholy piano instrumental with a spoken word verse by Big Rube. A simple but very impactful start to the song, it makes it stand out from the rest of the album. After transitioning into the growing old portion of the song, the piano instrumental is present again, this time with snare and bass drum samples, and a smooth hook by Deborah Killings. After the verses, the song continues to just vibe and just where we would expect the ending of the song to start, Drake comes in with a different hook that slowly builds in volume to the end of the song, and this serves as a proper ending to the album. This track was produced by Big Boy and Dre, which is a little preview of their composition techniques and ideas that will be later expanded on in future albums when it comes to the unconventional hip-hop productions. If you were to listen to this album today, I highly suggest listening to the 25th Anniversary Deluxe Edition of the album, which includes all the instrumentals from the album. This gives you opportunity to listen to the excellent production in this album and how the space theme is used so effectively at portraying this outer world experience and the dark sound it exudes. The lyrical content in ATLiens is a significant step up from what was presented in Southern playlists of Cadillac music. Despite the album being themed around the space theme, the lyrics mostly do not reflect that. At the same time, the lyrics aren't the gangsta light lyrics that we heard in their first album. What you have here is a mixture of different song structures and ideas. The standout in this album instantly is Andre's verses. Some of his best verses ever are on this album. Verse 2 in Two Dope Boys, verse 2 and 4 in ATLiens, verse 1 on Jazzy Bell, verse 4 in Elevators are all fire. Andre is in rare form on this album, and his verses in this album live rent-free in my head. And don't get me wrong, Big Boy stepped up a lot on this album, but Andre stands out compared to him. I also think this is an album where their styles begin to show a lot more difference between them. They had some similarities in the last album between their subject matter and flow, but in ATLiens, Andre seems to tell stories more in his verses, while Big Boy seems to reference a lot of the local experiences of living in Atlanta. So another reason why I feel like Andre's verses are better is because they have much more broader appeal to them, and they're not just focused on Atlanta from the mid-90s or filled with dated references. Goodie Mob and some elements of Organized Noise is present in his album, albeit in a much more reduced fashion from the first album. Seal Green is only found on Waylon, and just with the hook on some soulful hums. The rest of the Goodie Mob lays down some great verses in the latter half on the album on Mainstream and Decatur Song. Other than these songs, features are at a minimum, with most of the tracks just having some light vocal features for the hooks. There's also no skits in the album compared to the first, which does make this album seem a lot more focused than before. This is one of my favorite Outkast albums, so the list of my favorite lyrics is extensive. So brace yourself for some of Outkast's best right here. Outkast's ATLiens is one of my favorite from the duo, and argue one of the best hip hop albums of all time. This is one of those albums where you can listen to it from top to bottom without stopping. From the production, the lyrics, the flow, and the pacing of the album, this is one of the greats that I cannot give enough praise for. The next album we'll look at is Equimini, Outkast's third album, which goes for a heavy style change to funk, soul, and R&B, and expounds on the group's creative compositions and sound. My name is Brian, and this has been Sound Test.